Well, welcome to our series, Using Talent Analytics to Drive Business Results. I'm Bill Schiemann, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Metrus Group, we are an analytics firm, do a lot of work with surveys, and have a Metrus Institute, which is our research arm where we do leading edge work in analytics, leadership, and culture in particular. And HR best practices obviously get tied to most of those areas, and a range of clients from nonprofits to Fortune 50. And I'm delighted today to have Mark Blankenship joining me. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief People, Culture, and Corporate Strategy Officer of Jack in the Box. And he's joining me to share their survey analytic journey that took them to winning the HRM Impact Award last year. And that award is given by SIOP and SHRM, and their foundations have put a big emphasis on evidence-based management, linking science to practice. And to that end, they created this HRM Impact Award about 5 or 6 years ago to honor the firm in any given year that has had the best example of using that science and the analytics to actually drive business performance. So with that, I'm delighted to have Mark. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Glad to be here.
And maybe before we start the journey and sharing your story, maybe you could tell them a little bit about Jack in the Box.
Sure. Well, Jack in the Box is what we call a quick service restaurant business, more affectionately referred to as a fast food business. We've been around since 1951. We're considered a Southwest regional chain. We are a purpose-based organization, and our purpose is to nourish the pursuit of dreams. And we truly believe that we do deliver on that. When you take a look at our industry and our organization specifically, you can enter our business with very little education, relatively speaking, and not even necessarily speaking English as a primary language. And you can rise to the level of franchise owner. So, for example, our largest franchise owner today started off working in one of our restaurants.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So when you began this journey, and I know it's been a while now, I've known you since probably the mid 1990s, and when I met you, you were professional working in the HR organization there. Maybe you can share a little bit about your background and the journey you took to starting this whole focus on analytics.
Sure. Well, I'm a PhD IO trained psychologist, and spent many years kind of in the testing, selection, analytics realm prior to joining Jack in the Box. And when I came to Jack 20 years ago, what I observed, I think, is typical of most businesses, and that is we actually measure a lot of things. So when it comes to financial metrics, we had lots of metrics. When it came to operational, slash restaurant metrics, we had lots of measurements. And we actually measured a lot of people or human capital things as well. The only challenge is that they were all kind of siloed. The data didn't talk to one another. People used the information for their own business purposes. So it was a little disjointed when I first came to the organization.
Now, remember, there was a point in time where you began focused on the service profit chain and that area of work. Can you share a little bit about that early work that you began with?
Sure. And that's really where we started to, as I like to say, put the chocolate with the peanut butter, as it were. So, I think philosophically, the president of the company at the time believed in the service profit chain. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it simply states that if you hire the right talent and you do the right things for the talent, treat them fairly, pay them fairly, give them feedback, things like that, they're going to do a couple of things. They're going to stay longer, and they're going to deliver better levels of service to your customers or your guests. So in turn, then your business will perform better because your guests will be more loyal they'll come back more, and then you can reinvest some of those profits back into your talent. So that's the premise of the service profit chain. So our first foray into this was to take what we had at the time in terms of what we called our employee attitude or employee engagement survey data, and we married it up to the restaurant financial and operational data for the first time. And lo and behold, what we found was what many other organizations have found, that the human capability data were correlated with or predictive of both the financial and operational outcomes of the business.
So in that time period, Mark, what was sort of the leadership mindset in the organization? Was sort of everybody kind of bought in immediately to the service profit chain, or was that a sell that needed to be made during that period?
Yeah, I think, interestingly enough, Bill, I remember very vividly the first time I presented the results to what was then the executive leadership team, the corporate officer group. And out of all the information, they were most interested in the correlations between turnover and food cost and labor cost. And they were also curious as to who even did the analysis. So they were like a little shocked that HR had done these analyses. It was kind of a first for the organization. Usually that stuff came out of financial planning, the financial analytics team.
Yeah, that's fascinating because in a way, it was HR coming in with some data that now had kind of practical decision-making impact.
Yeah, it was, from my perspective, they were looking at it a little narrowly. They, I don't think at the time appreciated the broader view of the power of the information. But also at the time, the best we could do was take the data down to the district level. So if you think about the structure of the business, you have restaurants, and typically you're going to have 7 to 10 restaurants reporting to a district manager. So we were able to combine the data at the district level, and that was about as granular as we could get at the time. So there were definitely some challenges, so what do you do with that information? Because while it was confirmatory of the service profit chain, it still made you think about the business in broad terms. And so, some of the things we really wanted to drill down into further were things, the specificity of the information, how practical would it be to deal with the information, how relevant are the results at the restaurant level, the operating restaurant level. And then lastly, to your point, getting buy-in from leadership in terms of, what do we do with this stuff?
Yeah. And at the time, was the primary mindset of leadership we'd like to have more engagement, or was it more we even need to know that more engagement has an impact on business results?
Yeah, again, they saw things very broadly. And I think, one of the challenges that I think most of us face today, especially when we're trying to share best practices with one another, is that there typically isn't a common understanding of what we all call engagement. So even within our own professional ranks across businesses, there's just a variety of, we all use the word engagement. We all talk about employee engagement. We all measure what we call engagement, but it's different things to different people. And engagement itself is as we've come to learn, Bill, in working with you all, is that it's just one piece of the pie.
Yeah. As you talked about the 5 areas, what was it about the service profit chain? I guess it took you so far, and then you really needed to take a step to get more granular and to begin to drill into those other areas. So can you share a little bit about that next step then after the service profit chain and the things you began doing?
Right. Well, this is where, our relationship with the Metrus Group really, started. It was where we had, now first connected people data to operational and financial data, but only at a very granular level. I think that, the power of the relationship with Metrus really focuses in on the people equity model, that I'm sure you can talk to the audience about. But it allowed us to parse the human capital data into relevant components and break it down and address these, 5 challenges. So it allowed us to get very specific, very practical, very much relevant to an individual restaurant manager. So that's another significant change that was brought to the process. Was we took the data down to the individual restaurant level, which made it very relevant for that manager. So it just went beyond, correlations and prediction and, oh, isn't this interesting, to we can actually take significant action at a local level to drive the business using this information.
Yeah. And if I recall, I mean, that was a big insight of where you really started seeing variance, a good deal of variance at the restaurant level, yet when things were aggregated, it wasn't as apparent what was going on. Is that fair?
I think that's very fair to say. I mean, I think we all know that as you roll information up from an individual department to a broader group to the organization, what you lose is the understanding of the variability in the data, and so you start to treat everybody as at the level at which you see the information. So if I look at, for example, the information across all restaurants, and I treated all restaurants as though they looked like that, it would be met with very mixed results. So the power of the process of taking the data down either to an individual department level or an individual restaurant level really adds a tremendous amount of value.
Yeah. Maybe take a pause for a moment, and on the screen I put up the people equity model for our listeners to get a sense of what that is. And this was a model that we developed at Metrus through our Metrus Institute, that research over about a 10-year period of time. And it was based on, I can't remember how many studies, over 100 studies we looked at it. So many variables and factors of influencing business performance or customer scores, financials, employee turnover, and no one of them seemed to work very well in predictability. In fact, we went in and looked at a lot of restaurants, or not restaurants, but organizations, where we looked at engagement alone, and it was just, sometimes it was a good predictor of business outcomes, other times it was not. And what we discovered and began to test at Metrus was these 3 factors that seemed to be the big elements that drove overall performance, where we could typically go in and predict more than 90% of the impact. And the first one was alignment. So it was, to what extent is everyone rowing in the same direction? Is there a clear line of sight between the employee and the business strategy? Can an employee understand what that is? Do they bought into the values? Do they understand the brand? And then the second area, and that one often, not always, but is often a pretty big driver of operational and financial performance. And the second one, capabilities, we built around so much work that showed that if you look at things through the eyes of the customer, or in your case, the guest who comes into the restaurant, there are 3 things that really make the performance for the customer pop. And that is, 1, do the people have the skills and abilities needed? Number 2, do they have information necessary to deliver? So if your IT system is not working or delivering a reservation somebody has at a at a rental car, for example, no matter how good the training is, they won't be able to deliver. And then lastly, do they have the resources available to do it? So if people go into a restaurant and a smoothie machine or something's not working, then there's a problem, and it's not, the employee obviously looks bad, and so does the restaurant. And then and that's a great predictor of guest or customer satisfaction. And then the last one's engagement. And when we think of engagement, we've learned that it's not just satisfiers or commitment, but employees who really become advocates are the most engaged. Those who are willing to stand up and talk about the organization publicly, those who volunteer for additional assignments. So many of those elements are really important in driving it. And it's often a predictor of turnover, but also other forms of performance. And what's interesting, Mark, I remember in some of your early analysis, and getting specific here, that one of the surprising findings, despite, there's sort of a large literature saying, gee, when engagement's down, people turn over. But, one of your biggest predictors of turnover was the capabilities dimension here. You want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, it's it's fascinating when you think about it like that, Bill, because I think oftentimes, again, we default to the engagement word when we talk about its relationship to other variables, and certainly it is correlated with turnover. But at Jack in the Box, what we found in actuality was this capabilities dimension, as it were, had the highest relationship to retention. It actually accounted for 46% of the variance. Almost half of the variance in turnover was explained wholly by capabilities, which also had the best correlation with guest satisfaction. And, when you think about, when you drill down into this capabilities bucket that you described, the competencies, information, and resources, it really makes a lot of sense. The challenge is if I simply went to a manager and said, your capability score is low, work on that, that's not really helpful. So I think, again, the partnership with your team is that, you're able to conduct these driver analyses. So within the dimension of capabilities, we can see statistically what on a behavioral basis is driving the capability score. This allows managers to focus in on, okay, now I can really kind of on a behavioral level break this down. I can go tackle this thing. Is it because I'm not providing the hands-on training? Is it because I'm not providing the computer-based training? What we found is that both are important. It's not one or the other. But this addresses the specificity and practicality piece of the data. Again, my business is not a complex business, but it's a fast-paced, high turnover business. And if you want to get the attention of leaders who run restaurants, you really need to make it practical and simple and show them how those dots connect, because now not only can they address it, but I can also be very specific in terms of how I hold them accountable to these things. So it's not like, hey, you're not working on capabilities. I can see, the percentage of people that have been certified on workstations, the percentage of people that have gone through onboarding. So their boss, the district manager, can get very specific with them and their specific opportunities at the restaurant level.
Yeah, one thing I think I liked about the use of analytics in that situation was some of the analyses that were done around some of the regression, relative weights analyses, enabled you to look at training and said, if you put in $1 into training, you're likely to get 5 times more impact than if you were doing, let's say, teamwork at the time or some other, other activity. So it seemed like it really helped you direct resources and justify that, to leadership.
Yeah, and again, it's the proof of the pudding, right? Kind of thing. It's like truly when you allow the managers to see their information, direct them in a way that they feel they have the efficacy to do it, and it's meaningful and practical, and then they actually start to see improved outcomes. And this all can happen very quickly. It's pretty unbelievable how quickly it can happen, unless a restaurant is struggling across multiple dimensions. Then you have broader issues to deal with. But otherwise, this is something where the organization yielded significant results in a very short period of time.
Mark, could you share a little bit about, I know you use some visualization and sharing results of the survey work in this ACE framework, and I just put the slide up from some of your results. Maybe you can share with the audience a little bit of how you use that and the kind of buy-in it may or may not have created, I guess, with the leadership team.
Right. So again, if you start with the specificity, challenge, when we started this research, right, the data only went to the area level. So if you're a district manager and you see that your A, C, and E scores are in the yellow, 80, 80, and 72 on the top of that graphic, you're going to treat each of those restaurants as though that's the way they look. When in fact, when you look at the data at the restaurant level, it's that individual variance that is incredibly powerful in 2 ways. One, right, on the one end of it, you can see restaurant 8, that's all red. That manager in that restaurant has very different needs than restaurant 1, that's all yellow. So this allows the district manager to get very specific with each of these leaders, but also it allows you to capture people who are doing things really well and use those leaders to help the other leaders, even if it's in just one dimension. So restaurant 6, who's green in capabilities, what might that manager be doing differently that that manager could share with their peers and or the system? How do you scale best practices in this way? So it's kind of an interesting way where you find that you actually uncover best practices almost by accident, as it were, but then you can scale them up very quickly to the rest of the system. And then those managers that are strong can also partner with their peers to help them improve their performance.
When you first went through this, and you can really see the differentiation here of the alignment capabilities and engagement scores in some of the restaurants, and obviously I know you had many others in with that kind of profile. So what was the reaction of the district managers, and as you started rolling the data down and getting them to buy in? Was there resistance initially in that group, and because it may affected their role or things you expected of them?
Right. But I think I don't think it was much of a surprise. For example, again, if we go back to this restaurant 8 in the bottom corner of that chart, that restaurant, in all likelihood, right, was struggling operationally and financially. So now the district manager gets to see another piece of information they didn't see before and actually address the drivers within the context of ACE to help improve the financial and operational performance. Now, odds are that manager was already spending a lot of time there, that district manager. They probably just didn't have the level of specificity they could help work with the restaurant manager on to turn the business around, as it were. The other piece of it that we learned is that just because of restaurants, we don't have an example on this page, but restaurants that are performing well, all green across the ACE dimensions, what we found, which was very powerful, is that those managers actually want to spend time with their boss, but the boss was spending time fighting fires. And so the data helped us address with the district managers what their responsibilities and roles were. And that was to spend time with all of their leaders, not just the ones that were struggling, not just fighting fires. And while the district managers didn't necessarily respond too positively to this at first, the engagement scores of the restaurant managers in a subsequent survey administration went way up once their boss started spending more time with them. So, the data were much more broadly applied than just saying, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Restaurant Manager, what can you be doing to drive your business better? This resulted in changes at the district manager level, at the vice president level, changes in rewards and recognitions, and other accountabilities. So you can reinforce the whole kind of ecosystem around the employee and their roles and responsibilities.
One of the things that struck me as being really important, and I remember along the way you did an experiment, I think maybe the first time through you had about 100 restaurants in the red with some scores in the red, and I remember you had focused some actions and worked through the process you've been talking about with the district managers and so forth. And you came back and did a pulse about 7 or 8 months later. And if I recall the numbers, about 90 out of those 100 restaurants were out of the red. And it to me, from a practical standpoint, what it said to me is, this is not like enduring quality. This will take, forever to change. You actually made a lot of movement with restaurants in a fairly short period of time.
Yeah, and again, this is, it was kind of like a simple outlier analysis, right, Bill? We looked at the restaurants that were triple red. As you mentioned, out of the chain, the whole chain, there were about 100 of them or so that fell into that category. And so we just gave them a little extra attention. And we held those leaders accountable to driving change. And, look, a certain percentage of those managers and district managers didn't survive the process because they weren't ready, willing, and able to make a change. They were happy with the way they were doing things. They may have even been achieving, some level of acceptable performance if you simply looked at financial outcomes. But they were probably also suffering huge amounts of turnover, poor morale, inconsistent guest satisfaction. So, the process worked very well to bring those outliers in, because you can go back and pulse, as you mentioned, within 6 months, and you can see the changes in the people, in the guest satisfaction scores, and in the financial performance of those units.
Well, in the interest of time, I know we've only got a few minutes left. I want to have you share, your thoughts about the ROI on the effort, because I'm sure that was a key issue for management. And I know you have some results that you could share with us. So maybe you could take us through the impact of the ACE data on the business performance.
Right.
And I'm putting up a slide right now on some of your performance here on the turnover and productivity.
Right. So, as might be expected, right, we've already mentioned that that the information is correlated to operational and financial data. So, when you look at restaurants that are optimized, as it were, triple greens versus sub-optimized, triple red, so you take those kind of contrast groups, you can see that turnover is significantly lower in the restaurants that are high in ACE. They're much more productive, and that productive measure, that's 2.3% labor as a percentage of sales. So, you can just do the quick math in your head. If you have a unit that's doing $1.5 million a year, 2.3% of the labor that goes into that restaurant is a significant amount of money. And as we pull back, and if you have other slides, we can speak to them. But what you see is that, obviously you translate the people performance into the guest performance, as it were. Higher performing restaurants also have fewer problems. And I think more important than that, they actually are able to recover when a guest has an issue, because even the best run restaurants are going to have guest problems. And we know for a fact through our consumer insights groups, one of the key things that drives guest loyalty is your ability to recover from a guest failure. So this whole, guest recovery process is huge for our business.
And then of course, the bottom line, I'm sure the CFO is, dancing and maybe in the street was the sales and profit.
Sure. And again, the reason you see such a big difference between, the profit percentage and the sales percentage is that there's a lot of things that happen in the middle of the P&L that affect profit, because you're reducing food waste, you're reducing labor cost, right? You're reducing a lot of things that add up to a lot of money in the middle of the P&L that affects the bottom of the P&L. So you're not only driving the top line performance because you're executing better, you're driving higher levels of guest satisfaction, so you're getting increased visits and increased average check. You're controlling a lot of the costs of your business that are often a mystery, right? You see the data, you see how they move, but you start to impact these things, it has a multiplicative effect. And when you look at this in dollars, right, it's about $27,000 in reduced turnover costs and $72,000 in increased profits per restaurant per year. So, again, if you just start doing the math and scaling this up, and in a time when we're at record low unemployment, where labor costs are going up for everybody, especially in our industry where, minimum wage is being impacted, our operators are looking for ways to control these costs more today than ever before in the past. So these dollars have a real impact on the business. It's tens of millions of dollars to our business.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you for being here for part one, and we're going to be coming back for a part two segment. They're truly impressive results, and when I think about what I would say an underperforming organization in the early stages as you went through this, to being able to use this to drive incredible performance overall, it's a pretty important story. So we're going to come back and talk with Mark a little bit about creating buy-in from leaders, the impact on succession planning, the role of HR plays in this process, and then some other applications of analytics in the next segment. So again, Mark, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bill. It was a pleasure.
We look forward to it. And please join us for part two of the session. And if you have questions, you can direct them to either my email or Mark's that we have displayed on this last slide. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.